So, I would love to take a couple minutes to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Rebecca Schwartz Mette is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University at Buffalo and a licensed clinical psychologist. Dr. Schwartz Mette is nationally recognized for her contributions to research on adolescent peer relationships and psychopathology. Her NIMH funded work takes a multi method approach to understanding the transactional impacts of friendships and mental health and seeks to identify behavioral mechanisms that predict why distressed adolescents are rejected by friends and how they influence the mental health of those around them. Dr. Schwartz Mette is a recipient of a 2020 Early Career Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association and currently serves as an associate editor at the Journal of Research on Adolescence. So she's with us today. We're very fortunate that she took time to be with us today. She's going to be talking today on friendships in adolescence, a lifeline or a load. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schwartz Mette.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you all for being here. Let me just pop some slides up and we look good, Stephanie. All right, great. Well, thank you. Thank you again for spending time on this beautiful sunny day here in Western New York together. So without any further ado, get going. So hello, just wanted to say again, I'm so excited to be with you today to talk about a topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and questions as you consider it as well. So let's get started. All right, so I know that I am most likely preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to briefly review the central importance of friendships and mental health or emotional adjustment at adolescence. So theory and research for many, many decades now from multiple scholars have demonstrated that friendships offer youth many social and emotional benefits. So things like feelings of acceptance and belongingness, companionship, intimacy and emotional connection, of course, social support. And also, it's important to acknowledge that friendships, particularly in adolescence, are a very important context in which youth continue to develop their identities, as well as receive quite a bit of emotion socialization from their peers and from their friends. At the same time, adolescence tends to be a time of enhanced risk for the development of certain forms of psychopathology, such as depressive symptoms and self-destructive behaviors like self-injury and suicide. So recent estimates are now positing or are now declaring that up to half of youth have some kind of mental health disorder. And we know that these mental health challenges put youth at risk for a variety of other challenges, whether they be academic, social, or even other emotional issues. And even subclinical symptoms are associated with distress and impairment. These are just some recent numbers of clinical diagnoses. So over 30% of adolescents have a diagnosis of some kind of anxiety disorder, 1 in 5 depression. Almost 1 in 5 are reporting that they self-injure, and 10% of kids, reporting that they have made an attempt to harm themselves. Okay, so how do these two things fit together, friendships and emotional adjustment? Well, theory as early as Harry Sullivan's interpersonal theory of psychiatry from the 50s proposed that friendships as the sort of relationship of focus or central relationship at adolescence contribute to mental health. And the bulk of our research on how these constructs are connected comes from developmental science and looks at this direction of effect. How do friendships or friendship issues predict emotional adjustment issues? It's important to acknowledge, though, that youth bring with them characteristics to these relationships such as having emotional adjustment problems. And these challenges do impact their relationships. There are fewer studies looking at this direction of effect. How do emotional adjustment problems impact friendships? And they tend to come from clinical psychological science. And this is actually the lens through which I primarily view my work and my research questions, but we will be talking about both directions of effect today because it's essential to acknowledge that these associations are very likely transactional. And so from a developmental psychopathology perspective, which studies how do these problems come to be and what helps to explain why some kids might develop challenges over time and some kids may not. And we could tell a story starting in either one of these bubbles, right? Sally is sad and withdrawn and starts hanging out with her friends less and less, and over time those friendships deteriorate. Or Sally's friendships aren't very supportive. And so over time, she starts to develop some anxiety around belongingness, which impacts her well-being. All right. So for the purposes of my talk today, I just want to root this work in its theoretical foundation. There are lots of theories that contribute to my understanding, but this one, the interpersonal theory of depression, really guides my thinking. So interpersonal theories of depression were first proposed by James Coyne and later elaborated by folks like Tom Joyner, Constance Hammond, Karen Rudolph, Mitch Prinstein, and others. And this theory proposes that depressed individuals tend to experience an erosion of their social supports over time. And I'll be talking about which then sadly contributes to more distress and depression. And so I'll be talking about a few studies that look at this part of the theory. The theory also suggests that for those friends who continue to stick around that depressed individual, they may be more likely to develop depression or emotional adjustment problems themselves. And this is a phenomenon that has been referred to as contagion or the socialization of depression. And this is really the second arm of my program of research, and I'll talk about a couple of studies that fit into that lens as well. All right, so the first project I'd like to share with you was a meta-analysis, or actually several meta-analyses that grew out of mine and many others' observations that when you go to the literature and you try to look for links between friendship experiences and youth's emotional adjustment, sometimes the effects are there and strong, sometimes they're there and they're tiny, and sometimes they're not there at all. And so what do you do when you find mixed literature? You look for every study on a topic and publish 16 meta-analyses. No, just kidding. That's just what I did. All right. So these meta-analyses, they were indeed 16, report analyses with 589 different effects from 233 studies. We looked at concurrent and longitudinal effects, linking various friendship experiences, such as the number of friends kids have, how positive they report their friendship to be, how supportive, how negative, like what's that negative quality look like? Is there any conflict in the friendship? And looking at the links between those friendship experiences and two different emotional outcomes, depressive symptoms and loneliness. And then we looked at moderator effects to see if there were differences by age group, gender identity, the link between longitudinal assessments, whether or not the friendships were reciprocated, etc. All right, so I'm including this Prisma diagram because who doesn't love a Prisma flow diagram? But it just shows how we searched the literature and then arrived at our 233 studies. Okay, so what did we find? Well, in terms of links, concurrent effects or links between friendship experiences and depressive symptoms, we see that number of friends and positive friendship quality are both inversely related to depressive symptoms. So Kids with lower numbers of friends and lower levels of positive friendship quality are reporting higher levels of depressive symptoms. And then a positive association between negative friendship quality and depression. So the higher the conflict or negative features of a friendship, the greater the depressive symptoms reported. Similar pattern of results for loneliness, except you might notice that in some cases, particularly for number of friends and positive friendship quality, the effects are even stronger. This makes a lot of sense because loneliness often precedes depression and is actually more common than the experience of depressive symptoms themselves. In terms of longitudinal effects, we looked at both directions of effect. So first, looking at how friendship experiences predict later emotional adjustment, same pattern again. And pretty similar effect sizes for both number of friends, predicting later depressive symptoms and loneliness. Lower positive friendship quality, predicting increased depressive symptoms, increased loneliness over time. And for negative friendship quality, another positive effect here. So higher conflict and antagonism, things like that in a friendship, more depression. You'll see loneliness grayed out there if you've got good eyesight. That's because we endeavored to look at longitudinal links between negative friendship quality and loneliness, but there weren't any studies on that. So any students in the audience, you've got a project. All right. In terms of the other direction of effect, how does emotional adjustment predict later friendship outcomes? We see some smaller effects here, but again, just as hypothesized that yes, indeed, these earlier emotional adjustment problems predicting later friendship problems over time. So fewer friends, lower positive quality, and higher conflict, at least for depressive symptoms. All right, we were able to do quite a few additional analyses, and I won't get too bogged down in all of the numbers, but overall, we were able to test and determine whether the effects for depression or loneliness were stronger, and they were indeed stronger for loneliness, which you can see with your eyeballs, but it's also great to have statistical support. And that the effects with negative friendship quality, particularly on depression or with depression, were stronger than those of positive friendship quality. In terms of moderation, we did not find much. So gender identity, actually all of the studies included only operationalized gender as binary. And we found one differential effect for girls versus boys, that the link between initial positive friendship quality and later depression was stronger for girls than for boys. And then we had a couple of age effects having to do with depressive symptoms, showing that the effects for younger kids were actually worse than for older kids. We found no evidence to suggest that effects varied by the length between longitudinal assessments, whether or not the friendships were reciprocated, which is very interesting for any peer relations researchers out in the audience, and publication year. We also tested for publication bias using several methods and found no evidence of publication bias. Okay, so results of that meta-analysis inspired me to tackle a couple of lingering questions in a new data set of adolescent best friend pairs that were tracked every 3 months across 6 months. Results suggested here that friendship problems led to depressive symptoms, which then led to more friendship problems, and that depressive symptoms led to more friendship problems, which led to more depressive symptoms. So we have some evidence for transactional processes and that both friendships and symptoms can drive change in the other. Very interestingly, this study, we asked, so we brought kids in with their closest friend. They got to pick their closest friend to come into the lab. And we asked both kids and their friends about how the friendship was going. And we found these linkages only with self-reported friendship quality. So what that means is if there is a kiddo with high levels of depressive symptoms, they are very likely to report that their friendships are not going so well. We did not see any significant links between depressive symptoms in an adolescent and their friends' report of the friendship quality. So interestingly, we may have some additional variables to look at, such as cognitive bias, right? So if kids are depressed, they may not see their friendships as positive as they may be. And so that will be an important area for future study. So this got me thinking about whether or not all depressed adolescents are going to have friendship problems. Is it truly what Coyne thought way back when? In his theory really said that all depressed individuals sort of engage in aversive behaviors that make people not want to be around them. But I was wondering if that was really true, and actually this had never been tested before. So recall that this interpersonal theory of depression is suggesting that depressed people exhibit certain aversive or off-putting behaviors that cause others to distance themselves and eventually reject the depressed person. And in this project, I investigated a candidate interpersonal behavior called conversational self-focus. And conversational self-focus is a construct I developed and started studying in graduate school when I was looking at all of these video recorded interactions of adolescents and their closest friends talking about problems. And what I observed was that some adolescents appeared to have some difficulty disengaging with their own stuff, their own worries and concerns, and really had a hard time focusing on the other person when they were talking. And they would kind of turn conversations to focus on themselves. And kind of redirect. And indeed, when you really read Coyne's original writings, he talks about the self-focused behavior of depressed people. Now, of course, he wasn't talking about adolescents. He developed his theory on young adults. But I wondered if we could get at that, if we could measure this behavior. And so over the years, we've developed at least 4 ways of measuring self-focus. So we have a self-report questionnaire that we give to people. But because it may not be a behavior that people want to admit to doing, or maybe even they don't know that they're doing it, we also developed a friend report or other report questionnaire for this behavior. There's a reliable and validated coding system that has been developed to get at both macro and micro measurements of self-focus. And then something that we're into now is some micro-linguistic analysis and really seeing what words these kids are using. So let me let me tell you results before we go. So what we found in this study was that the initial study of self-focus was that kids' self-focus levels that we could observe and code observationally were related to higher levels of depression, and also some friend-reported friendship difficulties. But we endeavored to test this using some stricter statistics and a bigger sample. So before I get into the results of that, let me give you some examples from real life adolescents of conversational self-focus. So the yellow bubble here where it says, "Today was so rough, I'm freaking out." That could be considered a problem statement. So then we would look to see, okay, what does the friend say right after an adolescent shares one of these problem statements? And so we found that self-focusers can do this in a variety of ways. So one way is to one-up the other person and sort of say like, "Oh yeah, you think that's bad? How about me?" And then go on and talk all about themselves. They can change the subject. This is actually from a transcript. I think the boy who made the problem statement was actually talking about an alcoholic parent to their friend and sort of saying, "Well, my problem is this thing." And the friend replied by saying, "Dude, I'm starving." So changing the subject. And another example that we're really leaning more into now is to look at the proportion of self-referent pronouns used. So things like I, me, my, as another indicator of self-focus. In terms of our global coding system, it encapsulates both turning conversations as well as dominating conversations. And that's what we used in this study. All right, so what did we find? Well, first we tested Coyne's mediation hypothesis, which says that everyone who has depression, this is going to lead to them engaging in self-reference speech or self-focus as we're operationalizing it, which then leads to rejection. That's different from the possibility that I was interested in exploring, which is a moderation hypothesis, meaning like maybe at certain levels of self-focus or depression, we could get that combination leading to friendship problems or rejection. And in particular, we were interested in the combination of high depression or high levels of depressive symptoms and high observed self-focus when talking with a best friend about problems. So in this study, we had almost 650 adolescents in 320 friendship dyads. They had just finished the 7th or 10th grade. And a mostly white sample, although we did oversample for African-American youth to reflect the surrounding communities in which the sample was collected. And we did see support for this moderation hypothesis. So when adolescents were reporting high levels of depressive symptoms, but they were not engaging in high levels of self-focus, no friendship problems. It was really only the kiddos who had high levels of depression were observed to, have high levels of conversational self-focus in this lab-based conversation. And then it was actually their friends reporting 9 months later, increased withdrawal and actually rejection of the child. So I thought this was a really encouraging finding because I think it provides a lot more nuance to original interpersonal theories of depression, suggesting that maybe it's not everyone. And, anytime I see a moderator, I see a target for intervention. Okay. But let's go and now talk about a couple of studies that tackle this other possibility that Coyne and others have put forth. So let's say that some friends of distressed or depressed youth don't distance themselves from the distressed adolescent, but rather they stay in that relationship. Interpersonal theory of depression would say that those kids are at risk for contagion effects or increases in their own emotional adjustment problems just by virtue of being around someone who is distressed. So let's explore that thought. All right. So first, let's talk about what is socialization or contagion, as it has historically been called in the literature. So contagion or socialization of distress is defined as a phenomenon in which an individual begins to exhibit behaviors, including thoughts and feelings, that are similar to the behaviors exhibited by those around them. So if you're thinking, wow, this sounds like peer influence, you're exactly right. This phenomenon has been documented for so many things, clothing choices, taste in food, like all sorts of things. But in terms of depressive symptoms, we have quite a lot of evidence that having a roommate with depression, having friends with depression, having coworkers with depression, or intimate or romantic partners with depression does give us an increased risk for developing those symptoms themselves. But these studies had all been conducted on adults or college students. And there was a lot of support for depressive symptoms. In adolescence, there were just a handful of studies, most of them focused on the contagion of deviant behaviors, some externalizing behaviors. There were a couple of studies on depressive symptoms, and then a couple of studies on things like disordered eating and body image concerns, as well as risky sex and substance use. So it all makes a lot of sense, right? It's sort of everything we've ever heard from parents and teachers all across our own development about the influence of peers. But we'll dig into what this has meant in depression. Contagion itself is distinct from the process of contagion, or the processes by which these behaviors, including thoughts and feelings from close others, influence our own behaviors. So we can document the phenomenon, but up until this point, we really hadn't seen any evidence of a mechanism, except some really interesting studies out of Oregon, and Tom DeShawn and his research group that found that, so what he did was he brought male identified adolescents into the lab with a close friend and had them talk about whatever. And he found that the degree to which friends laughed at or had a positive reaction to talk about deviant behavior predicted increases in both kids' deviant behaviors over time. And so I started thinking, wow, if it works that way, if talking about your deviant behaviors can increase those behaviors in yourself and in your friends, what about the way kids talk about their worries and concerns? So that got me thinking about that. We did have some clues from the literature on moderators of contagion. So under what conditions is contagion especially likely to occur? A couple of interesting things out of Mitch Prinstein's lab at UNC. So kids who are more socially anxious are more likely to be influenced, right? The higher the peer status of the depressed person, the more likely we are to be influenced. And very interestingly, the closer and more positive the friendship, the more likely contagion would occur. And so this second half of the talk, I'm going to be talking about my earlier work on depressive and anxiety symptom contagion, and then some newer work as I've extended into self-destructive behaviors. Okay, so depression contagion. I've talked to you about how it's been well documented in adults. There were a few studies on adolescents, but nothing on children, nothing on other internalizing symptoms such as anxiety, which we know tends to precede the onset of depressive symptoms in adolescents and is more common in children. We don't know about gender differences in contagion effects, and we still didn't know how depression contagion could happen, right? Is it just sort of being in the same room as someone? Well, no, there's got to be something about the interaction, right? Because this is not a biological contagion, but rather a social one. So as I mentioned, I thought, maybe it's the way kids are sitting around and talking about how bad they feel or their worries and concerns that has something to do with it. And so my graduate mentor, I had the great fortune of working with Amanda Rose at the University of Missouri, and she had fairly recently at the time developed this construct of co-rumination with which many of you may be familiar. So co-rumination is a dyadic behavior. It is something you can observe. It is something that two people do together. And loosely defined, it is excessive talking about problems. We can break it down into its component parts. One is rehashing the problem over and over again. So maybe, these friends have talked about this issue before, but they're continually bringing it up. I just can't believe this is happening, et cetera, et cetera. Speculating about the causes and the consequences of the problem. So why did this problem happen? What bad things are going to happen now because this problem has happened? There's also a high level of focus on negative affect, or how bad or sad the problem is making you feel, and this dyadic encouragement of the problem talk to continue. So interestingly, co-rumination, both concurrently and over time, is associated with higher levels of positive friendship quality, which, as many of you know, includes things like companionship, validation, intimacy, emotional closeness, that kind of stuff, as well as higher levels of depression and anxiety symptoms. So it's this construct that has some social and emotional trade-offs, which I just find really interesting. So I thought maybe co-rumination might help to explain the transmission of depressive and anxiety symptoms in youth. And so for this study, we had about 550 kids in two groups. We had a group of children who were in the third or fifth grades, and we had a group of adolescents in the seventh or ninth grades. On the basis of sociometric friendship nominations in school, we paired them into 274 reciprocal same gender identifying friendship dyads. We measured their depression, anxiety, their reported co-rumination with friends. And then because I was really interested in if it was just simply sharing about thoughts and feelings, like in a way we might describe as normative self-disclosure, because normative self-disclosure is related to positive friendship quality and less depression. Or is it this very extreme focus on how bad the problem is that would help facilitate it? So we measured both co-rumination and self-disclosure. And for anyone who loves math, like I do, we used actor-partner interdependence models, which I'm happy to talk more about. But I am intentionally not clouding all of the slides with a bunch of numbers today. All right, this is what the statistical model looks like. So you can see what is the stability of youth's distress from time 1 to time 2, the B1 path, these are actor paths. And then the contagion effect or the partner effect that we're interested in is when you control for that within person stability, which tends to be high, of distress, is there any influence over and above that of the friend's emotional adjustment? Okay. So we found a small but significant depression contagion effect for both adolescents and children, which was really interesting because this question of, does it exist had not been asked in samples of children yet. We also found evidence for anxiety contagion for everyone except younger boys. So for our third and fifth grade boys, that did not seem to be a relevant process that was going on. But for everyone else in the sample, we did see anxiety contagion. And actually, the anxiety contagion effect was a bit stronger than the depression contagion effect. And then we asked the question, does co-rumination mediate the contagion of depression for and anxiety symptoms? So this top diagram shows the mediation model for adolescents. And these effects do not include children because co-rumination actually did not mediate depression contagion for children. This makes sense. Co-rumination tends to be highest or most common in adolescent samples, and particularly female identifying adolescents. But we found that so if I'm youth A and I'm friends with a youth B, my depression will predict the dyad's engagement in co-rumination, which then increases both my own but also my friend's depression. And then the bottom figure is our co-rumination mediation model for so for everybody except for the younger boys. And this model held showing, yes, that co-rumination did mediate anxiety contagion for everyone except for our third and fifth grade boys. Self-disclosure, interestingly, was not related to depressive symptoms in this study, and it didn't mediate any contagion effects for any group. So this underscores what we already knew, which is normative self-disclosure, sharing thoughts and feelings with somebody, getting some response, and then after a time moving on is actually really good for adjustment and for relationships. Co-rumination and its extreme focus on problems and how bad you feel seems to confer these adjustment risks. And of course, the very interesting thing here is both interpersonal processes are linked with close, supportive friendships. So what this means or could mean is that for kids who are co-ruminating with close friends, it might be hard to get them to stop because it feels really good. It feels like, wow, my friend really understands me, but it's not moving the needle on symptom reduction. And in fact, it's serving to exacerbate that symptomology over time. So then I got curious about under what conditions would co-rumination most easily facilitate contagion? Again, is it all co-ruminative conversations that carry this risk? Or when does co-rumination facilitate? In this study, we looked at depression contagion only. So this is a new sample, about 500 kids, again, paired in reciprocal friendship dyads. And we found some really interesting things. We found that characteristics of the friend, of the adolescent, and of the relationship seem to enhance co-rumination's mediating effects. So if I'm friends with someone who is depressed and we're talking about problems, if I have very high levels of empathy, we operationalize this as sort of overactive empathy in this study, then I'm going to be more likely to experience depression contagion. And this makes sense, right? Some folks with a lot of empathy almost take on the problems of others as their own. And, you know, we can get real biological with this and drill down to the mirror neurons in our brain that prompt us even unconsciously to start to mirror who we're speaking with and maybe even start to feel a little bit of what they are feeling. We also found that certain characteristics of the adolescent who is distressed, in this case, depressed adolescents who also engaged in very high levels of excessive reassurance seeking, which is exactly what it sounds like. It sounds like someone repeatedly asking for assurances that they are truly loved and truly cared for, even if they've already had that same conversation with that person 8 times already, sort of like, I don't really believe you that everybody doesn't hate me. Can you please tell me again? You could understand how that could get old after a while. And we hypothesized that that could lead to elevated depressive symptoms in the friend because they may feel like they're not really making a difference, or their friend may not be listening to them, or just feeling like, wow, you know, this person, you know, their depression isn't movable, and wow, it's really getting me down too. And then again, we replicated this effect for depression contagion being most strong in high positive friendship quality friendships. Okay, so I'm going to move on now and use the rest of our time to talk about some newer work focused on self-destructive and self-injurious behaviors. These are other emotional adjustment challenges that are pretty common in adolescence. And for which the question of, are these contagious, has been raised, but not a lot of real careful measurement and analysis of these effects had been done. So we'll talk about these now. All right, so let's get on the same page first about non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI. So non-suicidal self-injury is defined, or has been defined, as self-harming behavior without the intent to die. So this is not a suicide attempt. This is an on-purpose you know, self-injurious behavior, but it is not a suicide attempt. So these, you know, NSSI can take many forms, most commonly cutting, burning, hitting, etc. We have a lot of information on NSSI, and we know that it serves both intrapersonal and interpersonal functions. So intrapersonally, NSSI is a emotion regulation tool. It's a maladaptive one, but many individuals who engage in NSSI do so to help them regulate negative affect through most frequently negative reinforcement processes. So what this means is, if someone is feeling very distressed and they don't know what to do about it, if they have engaged in self-injury in the past, they may turn to that as a way to cope. And self-injury, from a physiological perspective, it does release endorphins. Obviously, it's a attentional shift from whatever the person is thinking about before, and what have you. So it is a coping tool. It's not an adaptive one, but there is a reason why people do it. It can also regulate negative affect through interpersonal processes. So communicating with others that someone is very distressed. When someone self-injures, they very likely receive a lot of support from others upon noticing the self-injury. In fewer cases, it can serve an aggressive or retaliatory function, but that is by far not the most common interpersonal function that we see in the literature. So up until I really got involved in this work, what I had noticed was there was although there was a suggestion of contagion in the literature, we weren't doing a good job of measuring either the process or even the behaviors. So if you look in the literature on NSSI, you'll see lots of studies that say, hey, we think that kids on adolescent inpatient psychiatric units are learning things from one another, and one of them might be NSSI. And it is the case, and it has been documented, that in those close settings where all the youth are really distressed, there can be this sort of spread of ideas or coping tools, if you will, because, kids get ideas from other kids. That's just what we know. So we had these documented, and then there were a couple of studies looking, asking kids who engage in self-injury, do your friends do this too? So sort of by proxy, estimating whether or not their friends are also engaging in NSSI just from the kids' perception. But that's imprecise, of course. And very few, I think at the time, maybe none of the studies had measured friendship reciprocity, which just means like, do both kids really say that they're really friends with one another? And very few studies, in fact, I think only 2 had actually measured the friends' self-injury. So I decided to get in on it and start to examine this question in my work. So these are results. This is a similar model that I've been showing today. These were, just shy of 200 adolescents in 93, again, reciprocal, same gender identifying friendship dyads. We measured the frequency of their engagement in non-suicidal self-injury over 3 and 6 months. And we measured some other things that I was interested in. How well are they intrapersonally regulating their own emotions? And then I wanted to see if we could replicate this effect for friendship quality being an especially conducive context for contagion to occur. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Yes, we see a partner effect, and I'll get to that in just a second, but I want to draw your attention to this. Any statisticians out there, you'll know that this is an exogenous covariance between friends NSSI and adolescents NSSI at time 1. You can think about this as a correlation, a standardized correlation. And what this is before we start following these kids over time, how similar were their levels of NSSI frequency at the very beginning? If you're paying attention to the previous slides, I didn't really highlight this, but this homophily effect or similarity effect is much, much higher for NSSI than it is for depression and anxiety, which I thought was really curious. So the question of do kids who self-harm form friendships with one another? The answer is yes. And then we see some moderate stability of within-person stability of NSSI over time. And then these other red circles, these show the contagion effects or the partner effects. These are about like 4 to 6 times as strong as what we have observed for depression and anxiety. So there is indeed something here. And so then we started asking questions, well, what about emotion regulation? And, emotion regulation problems have been cited as a risk factor for engaging in NSSI. Well, so maybe it's that and it's not the partner effects. So I won't show these figures because they get really crazy, lots and lots of lines. But basically, we found that emotion regulation problems were both an independent risk factor for sort of anyone's NSSI, right? So if I really struggle to regulate my emotions myself, I'm more likely to engage in NSSI, but it also made me more vulnerable to being influenced by a friend. So it was both an independent or unique risk factor, and it moderated contagion effects. What we didn't find was anything having to do with friendship quality. So we did not find the effect that we found for depression and anxiety, showing that especially close or positive friendships were more likely to facilitate contagion. But we didn't find the opposite either, that friendships that were highly contentious or full of conflict were especially likely, to show contagion of NSSI, perhaps through a mechanism of like coping with the friendship. So nothing to do with friendship quality there, which was really interesting. So there might be something different about the close friendships of kids who are engaging in NSSI, but we are still thinking about that. One question I have is, does co-rumination mediate self-injury contagion? Some kids do talk about self-injury with their friends openly, explicitly, etc. We have those transcripts, but many kids do not talk about it with their friends. So that's something that, we're thinking about. Also, are there other mechanisms, right? Is it, what other contexts might NSSI most easily spread? Is it just simple observational learning? Is it that, oh, I see my friend has a self-injury scar. I might ask them about it. I might not. I might know what it is. And then when I'm really, really distressed, I might think, oh, so-and-so has tried that, and then I might try it. Or, but I don't think that explains everything. I think, some NSSI is visible, but there's a lot that's not. And some kids do engage in self-injury with their friends. Chew on that one, but many don't. So, there's still a lot to learn and other possible third variables for us to consider. Okay, and finally, I'm going to talk about my most recent expansion of this work into suicide risk and exploring whether risk for suicide is socialized within friendships. Okay, so a couple of studies here, one headed by one of my graduate students, Trevor Long, and another one that's in preparation that we'll be discussing at SRCD next week. All right. So first, my student Trevor was really interested in this idea of direct versus indirect socialization of suicide risk. And there's been some writing about this. Direct socialization is like, my depression predicts your depression. Indirect socialization might be something like, my depression predicts your anxiety, right? So not the same type of symptom spreading, but some kind of distress spread. And so we looked to Tom Joyner's interpersonal psychological theory of suicide for some ideas here. And what Joyner says is that risk for suicide requires a few ingredients, some social cognitive risk factors, things like feeling like you're a burden to other people or not feeling like you belong. And also the kind of eroding or desensitization of our self-preservation instinct. What does that mean? Well, it means that many people have an aversion to, harm, right? And harming the self, that we have this instinct to kind of not do that. Folks who are at risk for suicide often have desensitized reactions to self-injury, both the idea of it and their own. So many of these studies on the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide have used self-injury as a proxy for this desensitization, right? So engaging in this regular self-injury is evidence that to some degree that this individual can do it, right? Can actually harm the self. Okay, so what did we find? Okay, so this is our direct suicide risk socialization model, and we don't find any evidence of direct socialization of suicide risk from friend A to friend B in these dyads. What I do want to draw your attention to, see red circle, is the similarity estimate, right? So you'll recall that I made a big deal out of the NSSI similarity estimate. The suicide risk one is even higher. So it is the case that just like on a whole host of other characteristics characteristics, birds of a feather tend to flock together. This makes a lot of sense. There's probably reduced stigma, more validation, more understanding, maybe more support in these friendship dyads. And given that we do have some evidence for some contagion effects, it is an interesting question about how could these friendships go while, retaining the supportive stuff, but maybe not getting into the more damaging stuff. Okay, so no evidence of direct socialization of suicide risk, but when we got kind of creative about our thinking, what we did find was that we did see direct socialization of suicide risk for kids who were already self-injuring. So this is the model for adolescents who had pre-existing NSSI before the study started, so at baseline. And then we do see this, little contagion effect from 3 months to 6 months pop out. And this might be that, kids who, this jives with Joiner's model to some degree in that, NSSI might confer additional risk for suicide in addition to these other social cognitive variables. So we're interested to continue to explore this because there has not been good studies of dyadic socialization of suicide risk in the adolescent peer relations literature. The last project that I'm going to talk about today is our very newest work, and we're going to SRCD next week and talking about this. This is some of our first work flowing from a recent grant from NIH that we wrapped up, focused on these questions exactly: socialization of depression, NSSI, and suicide risk within friendship dyads, but also across their social networks. And whether co-rumination has anything to do with that. So there's a ton to do with this data set. So, stay tuned. But the first step for me was to look at, okay, is co-rumination linked with adolescents' own risk for suicide at all, like even to begin with? We had seen several dyads over the years talk together about their suicidality in various forms, but we wanted to know if kids, were co-ruminating about it. Okay, so this, the Birch Project, we had over 900 youth, and we followed them 5 times. We assessed them 5 times each over an academic year, and we started the study in 2019, and we were going to have these 3 gigantic, beautiful cohorts that we were going to combine at the end of it in 2022. Yeah, you know where this is going. And then COVID happened. So thanks to COVID, we weren't able to combine these cohorts because of the massive global pandemic event and interesting cohort effects, but we were able to capture some really important information. In fact, we were able to get ecological momentary assessment of kids' mood and all sorts of things in the first 2 weeks of their school shutdown. So if you're interested in that work and how that COVID loneliness and isolation contributed to suicide risk and self-injury and depression, you can check out that 2022 paper. But anyway, about co-rumination and suicide risk. So we just simply looked at, and this was all pre-COVID and pre-lockdown. So we just looked at, all right, without a global pandemic, tracking kids' suicide risk as measured in October of 2019 and February of 2019. How does co-rumination interact with that, if at all? And what we found was that co-rumination did significantly moderate the association between baseline suicide risk and suicide risk assessed 4 months later. And we saw that at very low levels of co-rumination, there was no change in adolescent suicide risk, so no association there. At average levels, we saw an increase of just over a quarter unit on the suicide risk scale across 4 months. And let me just show you this really quick. Okay, so the SBQR, the range of scores is 3 to 18. And once a kid hits 7, that is kind of a clinical cutoff for suicide risk. So keep that in mind. So an increase of about a little over a quarter of a point at average levels. But then when we got to high levels of co-rumination, we saw an increase of a half a point on that scale across 4 months, which for me, seeing the spread of these scores and seeing, that thankfully a lot of kids don't have clinically significant levels of risk. But a half a point increase across 4 months was interesting. When we look at regions of significance, we were able to show that at the highest levels observed of co-rumination observed in our sample, kids were increasing almost a full point. Our sample mean at baseline was 4.64. And so if you think about, the skew of that distribution and an increase of almost a point at high levels of co-rumination, it starts to be a more interesting question, or at least it is for me. So we'll be continuing to look into that. All right. Finally, I'll just tell you, we'll close with some other future research directions. So, formally testing whether co-rumination mediates socialization of self-injury and suicide risk within these dyadic friendships, but also looking at adolescent social networks. So we've been able to, for every participant, again, through sociometric friendship nominations, get an inventory of their social network and see who's connected to who and, what ties are reciprocal and all of that, and watch how these networks change over time in terms of the ties, but also how depression and self-injury and suicide risk may actually spread across these networks over time. We're also interested always in additional variables. So we've got a study that we're beginning to analyze now where we looked at physiological reactivity to stress and also the extent to which friends mirror adolescents' distress facial expressions using facial recognition software to see if those are vulnerability markers for contagion. And then parasocial interactions are very fascinating to me. Parasocial interactions are the relationships or connections, maybe I should say, that we feel with people we don't know personally. So if I'm an adolescent and I, watch a lot of TikTok, I may feel like I have a connection with my favorite TikToker or what have you. Or if I watch a show and I have a favorite show, I may feel like I really know that character or I really identify with that character. That's what parasocial interactions are. And I think these are endlessly fascinating. And I threw a measure of parasocial interactions into this grant when I read the paper that came out showing that adolescent death by suicide rates spiked after season 1 of 13 Reasons Why dropped on Netflix. And if you don't know about that show, 13 Reasons Why is a highly acclaimed Netflix series, several seasons of it now. But the first season included a really graphic death by suicide scene that I still can't stop thinking about. It was really surprising and really, really emotional. And now that scene has been, taken out and, all the things, but we actually have evidence to show that, that and other depictions of suicide in the media can serve to increase risk. And so I was really interested in our risky kids and our kids in great distress. Who are they affiliating with even online? Are they posting? We have a measure in this grant about what they post and what they digest in terms of social media. And the social media landscape for content on these topics is unfortunately very rich. And so we will be digging into all of these very, very important questions as we sift through the data. All right. Wow. 12:30 on the dot. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to, feel free to note my email address and get in touch anytime, but I think we'll let Stephanie handle some questions and I'd be excited to hear from you.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for really sharing this really important work that you and others have engaged in. It's honestly, it's really, really impressive. And, I think it's also very topical right now. I mean, you shared a little bit at the beginning just about sort of the prevalence rates of mental health disorders and things like that. And I know that many of us, whether we're parents or professionals or others kind of working in this area, is something we struggle with a little bit, right? Is supporting youth with peer relationships. A lot of what you talked about, it definitely has me honestly like thinking and reflecting a little bit about like my peer relationships right from when I was a teenager, but then also really I think thinking about how as an adult now like how to support kids in navigating these really tricky relationships. I thought it was really interesting. You talked, I think, a little bit about just how, having friends with mental health issues, and sort of the role of co-rumination and how that could be positive in some ways, right? In terms of like having a really supportive relationship, but then negative because it's not moving the needle at all, right? In terms of symptom. And I just think that's hard. So we do have some questions in the Q&A. There were a couple questions that came in with registration that I thought maybe we could tackle first just because I think they're really important. And a couple of questions I think were really related to so as either a parent or a professional working with a child, how can we help them if they have friends or peers that are experiencing depression, anxiety, mental health disorders? How can we help them, be supportive, right? Like in that relationship, but then also sort of not be at this risk of contagion, which you had sort of talked about. So I don't know if you maybe are able to speak to that at all and just helping, I think, right, like youth kind of navigate some of that.
Yeah, yes, it's a great question. And those of us working in these spaces, we talk all the time about, okay, well, what are we supposed to tell kids, And I think like I'd like to start there in answering this question. I think we need to tell kids about how relationships and communication and emotions work. That, there's a reason why you're similar to your friends. And, here's what we know about this. And, here's what feels really good when you have these conversations about what's going on. And it is very important to talk about how you're feeling, right? Self-disclosure, just sharing thoughts and feelings, getting social support, that's fantastic. And we were able to show it doesn't have anything to do with contagion. But what I don't think kids have a real great grasp on, which makes a lot of sense because their metacognition is developing still. I don't think they have a good idea of when that self-disclosure or talking about problems rolls from that into something like co-rumination. So talking to them about, okay, here's what's helpful, here's what's not, here's how you might recognize when you've sort of ventured over into this not helpful territory. How to connect with supportive adults, right? Like friends are not therapists, no matter what age you are. And so if I talk with kids and other professionals about helping kids understand that if you have a friend in distress, you shouldn't be the only one that knows about it. That's not a good secret to keep. And so, how could you and your friend talk to a trusted adult together about this, and sort of how to draw those boundaries. So that, we're not getting help for the kid who's originally in distress, and we're also not creating an undue burden on the other kid who does not have the training or the resources to deal with it. On another level, I tell people all the time, including my own teenager, that simply sitting around and talking about something that's bad or making you feel bad is not going to make you feel better, at least if you do it for a long time. That there is this sort of boost of social support and they really get me and all of that comes from sharing it. And oh yeah, that's awful. Like validation is so good, right? But if that's all you're doing, right? If you're not getting outside and doing activities and moving your body and taking time away from those problems, then that's another sign to look out for. So I often talk about co-rumination like cake. There could be too much of a good thing, right? You don't want a life without cake. Like, where's the joy, right? But like, you wouldn't eat it for 3 meals a day. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really helpful information. I think for adults to hear, right? But but then as well as teens. We did get so one question in the Q&A is very similar to what I just asked, but it's actually looking a little bit more at young adults. I know most of your research has really been with teens. But the question was, as a faculty member in a grad program for school psychology, I'm seeing more anxiety and depression, kind of co-rumination between grad students, typically young emerging adults in our program, and the contagion effect of this co-rumination. So any suggestions for how to approach this with our students? So I know you just shared a lot of really great, strategies, but I guess any thoughts too about sort of this young adulthood developmental period?
Yeah, yeah. I think that I'm so glad you asked this question because I think that these processes are alive and well in other developmental stages, in other populations, in other contexts. So there are some studies of co-rumination with coworkers, and it kind of works the same way. Like everybody feels worse about it, and the problems that people are raising feel bigger and harder to solve, and everybody's like more down about it. Um, and I haven't tested contagion in like workplaces or educational settings like a graduate program, but I've seen it firsthand, and I would be absolutely shocked if it wasn't a similar mechanism. And one thing I didn't get a chance to talk about today, but I think is so important in understanding how co-rumination can arise as like a go-to for coping. I really do think it is an effort to cope. It's an effort to connect. It's an effort to figure something out that's hard or ambiguous, like grad school, the future, all of that. Um, we are starting to see evidence that folks who are relying on co-rumination as a primary kind of regulatory tool tend to have a lot of difficulties intrapersonally regulating themselves. So for me, again, it's like psychoeducation about, hey, there are tools that you use for yourself to regulate emotion. And then there are ways you can get support to regulate from others. Here are some helpful ways to get support from others to regulate. Here are some less helpful or ways that may have some trade-offs. But I absolutely, oh, that would be a fascinating study. I absolutely believe that the similar kind of phenomena and processes are relevant in other settings, such as the one that the faculty mentioned.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We had another study, or I'm sorry, not study, another question related to, I think more of what you were talking about really at the end and thinking about some of your future directions related to kind of social media impacts with increases in suicide risk. So this question just asks, are there any studies of increases in suicide in recent years related to the prevalence of the rich landscape on social media related to the suicidal behavior or suicide content?
Sadly, yes. And I will say, I haven't conducted these studies myself. I'm not a social media expert. As a parent, I'm just as like ambivalent about it as anybody else. But yes, I can share with you. There have been studies. I think the bulk of them have to do with Facebook and Twitter when Twitter was Twitter. And it was something like, they were able to use like big data, right? Tens of thousands of people, and showing that the degree to which people were interacting with or viewing or engaging with suicide related content, whether that was an announcement about, a high profile death by suicide or other types of things like that, that there was an increased risk for those people just by interacting, right? So like, wow, that's mind blowing because you think about passive engagement with social media, the doom scrolling, like, just what and then you think about algorithms that are informed by your previous engagement with certain content. Um, so there's that, and that really fits with what we know about suicide clusters. That I didn't talk about this today, but having a death by suicide in your neighborhood, in your school, certainly in your peer group, increases risk for everyone around them for a certain period of time. So I do believe social media is playing a role, and I don't think we know exactly how it's all going to be clarified. We looked at in this study, and I've kind of glanced at this data. We do see that kids at elevated risk, both, higher levels of depression, more self-injury, more suicide risk, are reporting more than kids who are not at risk, that they are creating content related to self-harm and distress, and they are also viewing content. So, if I had all the money in the world, I would I would be getting all of this data, right, from kids' smartphones. Like, what are you searching for? We know kids are searching for methods. We know kids are reading about these things, but really, getting a sense of how much time and what they're generating and exactly what they're looking at. There are some deep, dark places on the World Wide Web for these topics. And sadly, they're not regulated very well, and the kids are seeing them.
I echo all of what you've just stated regarding social media. We do have another question in the chat. A question related to depression and deviant behaviors on healthy adolescent friends. Let me just pull it up here. I'm not actually see. I'm sorry. I have somebody just messaged me about a question that they had registered, but I'm not seeing it. But I do think we have time for one more question, and I'm wondering if maybe we could talk a little bit about social support. And so there were a couple questions related to the types of social support that is really sort of the most beneficial in kind of promoting some of these positive relationships in terms of like emotional support or informational support. And also if you feel like you've seen kind of this erosion of kind of social support over time, whether you found that maybe in your research or if you've experienced that or witnessed that in some of these things.
Yeah, I'll take that question first because I really I enjoyed receiving that question of like, have I personally or in the research observed this kind of withdrawal or erosion of social supports? And the answer is yes. I think that all of these ideas have come from, my experience as a human being or just watching these videos of how kids talk to one another, and noticing that, we measure their pre and post conversation affect, and kids who are like really talking about hard stuff and, sharing a lot and co-ruminating a lot, they report immediately after that they feel better, that they feel so close to their friend and their friend is so wonderful and they really get it. And then they're also telling us in the same breath, or rather the next screen on their survey, their problem feels bigger. Their problem feels harder to solve. They feel sad about the problem. And then tracking that affect out weeks and months, we see those increases in symptoms. So yeah, I mean, I didn't come up with co-rumination, but I definitely see it everywhere. And then all those other ideas, yeah, they really do come from just observing teenagers, which I think is the most responsible thing I can do to get ideas. In terms of the specific types of social support that are protective, yeah, there was a question about, okay, is instrumental aid or support, the most helpful or emotional or even, informational? And we have tackled this question in a couple of different ways, and also through the lens of gender differences, because as you may be aware, at least in terms of youth who identify within the gender binary, which is the bulk of our work or the research in the literature, um, we find that girls, and particularly adolescent girls, are co-ruminating the most. Adolescent boys absolutely co-ruminate, younger boys co-ruminate, but they don't do it as much. And so we see kind of different doses for different folks being helpful. Like instrumental help and informational aid is helpful for everyone. And I would encourage maybe an adolescent girl friendship dyad that was really relying on co-rumination as the way to feel close to one another and solve their problems. I would encourage them to shift to more, activity and active problem solving. And instead of generating 15 possible solutions to your problem and then talking about how they all won't work, maybe you select one and then you go outside for a walk and look at the sunshine and try it out and come back to it later. And we actually see that boys who engage in, so boys will tell you they don't really need self-disclosure, but when they get an average amount of it or like low levels of co-rumination, they are protected from depressive symptoms. Girls will tell you they want a lot of it and then they do even more. So, and then we see that kind of non-protective effect. So I think the ingredients to healthy friendships are there, but we have to think about for whom and when and under what circumstances. But definitely that I don't see it in my work, adjustment trade-offs from instrumental or informational aid. I think those things without any emotional support would fall flat and seem tone deaf. But leaning only into the emotional landscape may not be the best thing, especially for girls.
Great, thank you. So we are out of time. Thank you everyone for sticking around these last couple of minutes. I just wanted to share. So Bree Kishel did include the link to the evaluation survey. So please just take a couple minutes now to complete that. And then I also just wanted everyone to know to please save the date for our Alberti Center annual conference that will take place in person on Wednesday, October 22nd at Classics V Banquet Center in Buffalo. The theme of our conference is going to be building allyship and supports for LGBTQ plus students. So please subscribe to our mailing list and follow us on all of our social media handles to stay updated on all of our future speakers and events and the conference. But thank you again, Dr. Schwartz Mette, for just spending the last over an hour with us and really sharing your really great work. We very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.